My name is Serena Holloway. I'm 30. And I'm the structural engineer who signed the final safety certification on Charleston's tallest new building, the Meridian Tower, 3 months before my sister's wedding. I want you to remember that detail. Because in about 4 minutes, the woman who raised me is going to slam my 7-month pregnant body into a marble dessert table. And not one person in that ballroom is going to move to help me. Not my mother, not my sister, not one of the 200 guests who watched it happen. I had no idea. Sitting in the car outside the Palmetto Grand Hotel, smoothing down the navy dress I'd bought on clearance, that I had already been measured, calculated, and scheduled for collapse. Like a load-bearing wall nobody bothered to inspect. My husband Nathan wasn't with me. He was 2 states away, closing a 9-figure acquisition, and I'd told him to go, that I could survive one afternoon of my family without him. I actually believed that. "You look tired," my mother said, the second I walked through the ballroom doors. Not hello, not "you look nice" tired. Like I'd shown up to inconvenience her. I'd been the disappointment for as long as I could remember. Not because I'd done anything wrong. I'd graduated top of my class, passed my licensing exam on the first attempt, built a reputation that got my phone ringing before job postings went public. None of that mattered in my mother's house because Vanessa was marrying into money, and I had only ever been useful for comparison. "You're at table 14, my mother said, already turning away. Table 14 was in the back, near the kitchen doors, where the waitstaff bumped elbows carrying trays. I looked down at the seating card in my hand and felt my jaw tighten. But I didn't say anything. I never said anything. That was the arithmetic of my whole life. Stay quiet, stay small, and maybe eventually it would be enough. It never was. I found my seat between a second cousin I hadn't spoken to in years and an empty chair reserved for a +1 who never showed. Across the room, Vanessa stood in ivory silk under gold string lights, glowing the way brides are supposed to glow. My mother stepped up to the microphone before dinner, and I felt my stomach drop before she even opened her mouth. I'd learned to read her, the way I read structural drawings. Every small movement meant something was coming. "I just want to say," she began, dabbing at eyes that weren't actually wet, "how proud I am of my daughter, my successful daughter, the one who never gave me a single gray hair." She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. 200 people turned anyway, because everyone at that wedding already knew. There was another daughter somewhere in the room, the one who wasn't being toasted. If you've ever sat in a room while your family introduced someone else as their only successful child, drop a comment below. You're not the only one who's felt invisible at your own family's table. I pressed my hand flat against my belly and told myself it didn't matter. I was 30 years old. I had signed off on a building that would stand for 100 years after I was gone. I did not need my mother's approval to know what I was worth. But knowing something and feeling it are 2 different kinds of math. Dinner passed in the usual rhythm. Clinking forks, a string quartet, my mother's voice carrying across the room every time she introduced Vanessa to someone new. My successful daughter. My daughter, the future Mrs. Whitfield. Not once, in 3 hours, did she say my name. I told myself I'd stay for the cake, then slip out before the dancing started. My back ached. My ankles had swollen past the point where my shoes made sense. I wanted my own bed, and Nathan's voice telling me it was almost over. I didn't know yet how wrong I was about the word matter. It was near the dessert table, refilling my water because the champagne wasn't an option anymore, that I heard my mother's voice drop into a register. I recognized instantly the one she used when she thought no one important was listening. "After today," she murmured to Vanessa, close enough that I caught every word, "everything will belong to you." My hand went still on the pitcher, everything. What did that mean? Everything. My grandmother's estate hadn't even been discussed in years. Not since the falling out none of us ever talked about directly. I turned, slowly, the way you turn when your body already understands something to. Your mind hasn't caught up to yet. Vanessa was watching me. Not surprised. Not caught. She was watching me. The way you watch a countdown you already know the ending to. That's when my mother's hand closed around my arm. I want you to picture this. A slab of white marble, edges polished sharp enough to catch light, holding 6 tiers of wedding cake. My mother's hand on my arm, not steadying me, pushing. One motion. fast enough that I didn't have time to brace, didn't have time to do anything except feel my center of gravity disappear. I hit the table edge belly first. The sound that came out of me wasn't a scream. It was smaller than that. A sound I'd never made before and hoped to never make again, and then I was on the floor. Marble shards and buttercream, and 200 people going completely, suffocatingly silent. I looked up, one hand pressed against my stomach, searching the crowd for my mother's face, expecting horror, expecting anything human at all. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at Vanessa. And Vanessa, my sister in her ivory dress, under lights strung up for her happiness, was smiling. "Now maybe," she said, quiet enough that only the people closest to me could hear it. "You'll finally lose everything." I lay there on that marble floor doing the only math I had left in me. Not load limits or tensile strength, a different equation. The one where I finally understood I had never been a daughter in that family. I had been infrastructure. Something they built their comfort on top of, something they assumed would hold, no matter how much weight they piled on, until the day they decided it was more useful broken than standing. If you've ever realized mid-crisis that the people meant to protect you were the ones planning against you, you know that particular cold. Stay with me. What happened in the next 60 seconds is the part nobody at that wedding will ever forget. Someone screamed for a doctor. I remember the ceiling lights spinning slightly, my hands shaking against a stomach gone rigid with pain, and somewhere behind it all, the ballroom doors slamming open hard enough to crack against the wall. Nathan. He shouldn't have been there. He was supposed to be closing a deal. 3 states away, was supposed to be in a conference room in a city where nobody knew my mother's name. But he was there, cutting through 200 wedding guests like they were furniture, and the second his eyes found me on that floor, something in his face went perfectly, terrifyingly still. He didn't yell. He didn't demand answers from my mother, standing frozen 10 feet away with her hand still curled from where she'd shoved me. He knelt beside me, one hand cradling the back of my head, and his voice, when it came, was almost gentle. "I've got you," he said. "I've got you. Don't move." Paramedics arrived within minutes. Someone, I never found out who, had called the moment I hit the floor. As they lifted me onto the gurney, I watched Nathan stand, watched him turn toward the hotel's event manager, hovering near the kitchen doors, pale and useless. I expected the kind of fury every person in that room was bracing for. Instead, his voice came out flat, controlled, almost businesslike. "I need every second of security footage from this ballroom," he said. "Starting from this morning. Don't delete anything. Don't let anyone touch those files." The event manager blinked at him. "Sir, I don't think." "I'm not asking," Nathan said. I didn't understand it then. I was being wild out, with my hand pressed to my stomach, terrified for my daughter. I didn't understand why security footage mattered more to my husband than the woman who'd just knocked me to the floor. I didn't know yet that Nathan wasn't looking for an apology. He was building a case, and somewhere in that hotel's server room, a camera above the dessert table had already recorded something. My mother and sister never expected anyone to see. Something that had happened hours before I ever walked through those ballroom doors. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic, and the plastic sourness of a blood pressure cuff used 100 times before mine. I lay there with a monitor strapped across my belly, listening to my daughter's heartbeat thump out of the little speaker, steady and stubborn, while a nurse checked the bruising along my ribs. "You're lucky," the doctor told me. "Baby's fine, you'll be sore for a while, lucky." I turned that word over in my head until it stopped meaning anything. Nathan hadn't left my side except once, for maybe 10 minutes, and when he came back his jaw was tight in a way I recognized from board meetings gone wrong. He didn't tell me where he'd gone. I didn't ask. I stared at the ceiling tiles, replaying the sound of marble hitting my stomach, trying to understand how a woman who used to braid my hair before school could shove me hard enough to send me to a hospital bed. My mother called twice that night. I didn't answer. Vanessa didn't call at all. That silence taught me more than either of them realized. By the time they discharged me 2 days later, something in me had gone quiet in a different way. Not the quiet of staying small, a colder kind, the kind you get when you stop waiting for an apology and start paying attention instead. I'd spent 30 years measuring my worth by whether my mother finally noticed me. That week, lying on the couch with an ice pack against my ribs, I started measuring something else: how much I actually knew about my own family, and how little of it I'd ever bothered to write down. If you've ever had a moment where you stopped trying to be loved by someone and started trying to understand them instead, you know exactly the shift I'm talking about. It doesn't feel like anger. It feels like waking up. I started with the small things. My mother's story had always been that she'd raised Vanessa and me on a teacher's salary after my father left. That every sacrifice she made was for us. That Vanessa's wedding, the venue, the dress, the 4-carat ring, was proof of a family finally thriving after years of struggle. I'd believed that story my whole life. I'd felt guilty for years about not sending more money home, about choosing engineering instead of something faster paying, about not being there enough while my mother struggled. But struggling people don't casually mention a wedding venue that costs $80,000. And teachers' salaries, even after 30 years, don't produce that kind of money out of nowhere. I called my grandmother, not the version of the family everyone performed at holidays. My actual grandmother, my mother's mother, the one nobody talked about because of a falling out that happened before I was even born. The one my mother always described as difficult and controlling and better left alone. I hadn't spoken to her in 11 years. She answered on the second ring, like she'd been expecting the call for over a decade. "Serena," she said, something in her voice cracking slightly, like she'd practiced saying my name and still wasn't ready for how it would feel. I heard what happened. Word traveled fast in Charleston, even to a woman cut off from the family for over a decade. We talked for 2 hours that first call. She told me things my mother had spent my whole life rewriting. That the falling out hadn't been about money or pride, but about my mother borrowing against my grandmother's trust years earlier and never repaying it. About a pattern of quiet financial maneuvering going back decades. If you've ever discovered that the story you were raised on wasn't the real one, you know how strange it feels to sit with that kind of silence. "Keep reading, because it gets stranger." I asked her, carefully, about Vanessa's wedding, about where the money had come from. There was a pause long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Your mother," she finally said, "has been managing a trust that was never legally hers to touch." That sentence rearranged something in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, a legal pad beside it, and did the only thing I actually knew how to do. When something didn't make structural sense, I started building a file. I am an engineer. My career is built on the belief that if something is going to collapse, there are always warning signs first: hairline cracks, stress fractures, small deviations from plan nobody flags until the whole system fails. I had spent 30 years assuming my family's cruelty toward me was random, emotional, unpredictable. It wasn't. It had a pattern, and patterns leave records. Over the next 3 weeks, while I was supposed to be resting and healing, I built a spreadsheet: bank statement requests, public property records, a timeline that started the year I turned 18 and stretched to the week of Vanessa's wedding. My hands shook the first time I found the property transfer. A small rental unit that had belonged to my grandmother, quietly deeded to my mother's name 6 years earlier, without my grandmother's signature anywhere on the paperwork. I photographed the document. Then I sat still at my kitchen table for a long time, feeling something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was closer to recognition, the feeling of finally seeing the blueprint underneath a building you'd lived in your whole life, without understanding how it was held together. If you've ever found the paperwork that finally explained years of confusing behavior, you know this exact feeling. It's not satisfying. It's disorienting. Stick with me, because the deeper I went, the worse it got. Nathan found me at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, surrounded by printouts, my third cup of decaf gone cold beside my laptop. "You should be sleeping," he said, but he didn't try to stop me. He pulled out the chair across from me instead, picked up one of the property documents, read it twice, and set it back down. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I said. "That's what I'm trying to find out." He was quiet for a moment, studying my face in the way he did when deciding whether to push or wait. Nathan had grown up around boardrooms and hostile takeovers. He understood that the people who hurt you rarely do it loudly. They do it in paperwork, in quiet transfers, in decisions made while you're too busy being grateful to notice you're being erased. I can get you a forensic accountant, he said finally. Someone who specializes in exactly this. I shook my head. Not yet, I told him. I needed to understand it myself first. Needed to trace every thread with my own hands, because for 30 years, I had let other people write the story of who I was in that family, and I wasn't going to let anyone else write this part either. He didn't argue. He just refilled my coffee and sat with me until 4 a.m, both of us quiet, reading records that painted a picture neither of us had expected. What I found over those 3 weeks wasn't just one betrayal. It was an entire architecture of them. My mother had taken out a loan against my grandmother's property in my name. When I was 22, repaid using a joint account I hadn't known existed. She had listed Vanessa as a beneficiary on a life insurance policy, funded partially by money traced back to my grandmother's trust. And 3 months before the wedding, she liquidated an investment account, one with my late father's name still attached, to cover exactly the amount the venue had cost. Every dollar of Vanessa's dream wedding had a paper trail, and every paper trail led back to something that had never belonged to my mother in the first place. If you've ever done the math on exactly how much you gave a family member, money, time, forgiveness, versus what they gave back, you already understand the number I was staring at by the end of that week. It wasn't close. It had never been close. I thought about the seating chart. Table 14, near the kitchen doors. I thought about 30 years of birthdays, where I got a card and Vanessa got a check. I thought about my mother's voice on that microphone. My successful daughter. While somewhere in a drawer sat documents proving how that success had actually been financed, and whose sacrifice paid for it. I wasn't angry in the way I expected. I had thought, if I ever found proof of something like this, I would feel rage. Instead, I felt something colder and more useful, the clarity of an engineer who has found the exact point a structure will fail, and has decided calmly, precisely, what to do about it. I closed my laptop that night, my ribs still aching where the marble had caught me, and for the first time since the wedding, I didn't feel like the daughter who'd been pushed. I felt like someone building something of her own. My mother called on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the wedding, using the voice she reserved for asking favors. Warm, a little breathless, like nothing had happened at all. Serena, honey, I need you to look at something for me. Not how are you feeling. Not I'm sorry. Not one word about the marble table, the paramedics, or the daughter still healing inside me. She wanted something. It's the rental property, she said. The inspector's flagging a structural issue before I can close the sale. I told him my daughter's an engineer. Could you just take a look, sign off on something, make this go away? I sat very still on my kitchen stool, phone pressed to my ear, feeling my pulse tick up in my throat. The way it used to, supervisor asked me to fudge a number. I knew wasn't safe to fudge, the rental property. The one deeded from my grandmother's name to my mother's, 6 years earlier, without a signature that should have been there. Which property? I asked, keeping my voice level. The one on Ashworth. You remember I used to take you and Vanessa there when you were kids. I remembered it exactly. I also remembered, from 3 weeks of spreadsheets and public records, that the building had been sitting on a fault in its structural permit for over a decade. A code violation never properly resolved, patched instead of fixed. The kind of shortcut that saves money right up until it doesn't. You want me to falsify a safety inspection, I said. Not a question. I want you to help your mother, she said. And there it was, the same tone she'd used my entire life to turn a request into an obligation. You're always so dramatic about your little rules. It's one signature, Serena. Nobody's going to know. If you've ever had a family member ask you to risk your career, your license, or your integrity for something they broke, you already know the particular silence that follows. Stay with me, because that phone call changed something in me I didn't expect. I looked down at my stomach. My daughter kicked once, hard right under my ribs, like she was reminding me she was listening too. No, I said. The silence on the other end of the line lasted 3 full seconds. Excuse me? I said no. I'm not signing off on a building I know is unsafe so you can close a sale faster. After everything I've done for you. What have you done for me? The words came out before I could stop them, quiet, almost curious, the way you'd ask a question you already suspected the answer to. I'm asking honestly. What exactly have you done for me? She sputtered something about raising me, about sacrifices, about ingratitude, and I sat there listening to a script I'd heard my entire life, except this time I wasn't hearing the words, I was doing math. I thought about every time I'd driven 4 hours to help her move furniture. Every time I'd covered a bill she forgot to mention until the due date. Every graduation, every promotion, every milestone I'd downplayed, so it wouldn't overshadow whatever Vanessa was doing that year. I thought about 11 years of estrangement from a grandmother. My mother had painted as the villain, when the real story had been sitting in a filing cabinet the whole time. I have to go, I said, and hung up before she could answer. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was upset, because for the first time in my life I wasn't upset. I lay in bed next to Nathan, staring at the ceiling, running the numbers the way I'd run load calculations for 100 buildings before this one. Weight in, weight out. What a structure could bear before it failed. I had spent 30 years absorbing weight. Every slight, every dismissal, every quiet erasure. I'd carried it, told myself that was what family meant, that eventually the scale would balance if I gave enough. It never balances. That's the thing nobody tells you. Some people don't want balance. They want a foundation they never have to maintain, one they can build on top of indefinitely, and the moment that foundation shows a crack, the moment it asks for anything back, they don't repair it, they replace it. If you've ever realized that a role you'd been playing your whole life was never actually about love, you know how strange the quiet is afterward. It isn't peaceful, it's just very, very clear. 2 days later, my mother texted Vanessa's wedding photographer's invoice to me by accident, meant for someone else in a group thread, $42,000. I stared at the number, then opened my spreadsheet and added it to a column. I'd started calling privately, paid for by Serena, because that's what it was, even if my name had never touched a single check. I thought about the marble table again. How? When I traced the maintenance logs I'd requested from the hotel's facilities manager, using a request Nathan had quietly filed the week after the wedding, something didn't sit right. A single work order, dated the morning of the wedding, for minor furniture adjustment near the dessert display. No further detail. No name attached. My stomach turned in a way that had nothing to do with pregnancy. I called the hotel directly, gave my name, explained. I was following up on an incident report from Vanessa's wedding reception. The woman on the phone, after a pause and some hold music, told me the work order had been requested by the wedding party's coordinator, hired and paid for, it turned out, entirely by Vanessa. If you've ever had a small detail suddenly reframe an entire event in your memory, you understand exactly the cold that moved through me in that moment. Keep reading. Because this is where the arithmetic stopped being about money. I sat with that information for 2 full days before I told Nathan. Not because I doubted it, but because some part of me, the part that had spent 30 years hoping, needed time to accept that my sister hadn't simply failed to help me that day. She may have arranged the moment I fell. Nathan didn't react the way I expected when I showed him the maintenance log. He didn't get angry. He got quiet, the way he did before a major negotiation, and asked one question. What do you actually want to do with this? Not what do you want me to do. What do you want to do? And I realized, sitting across from him at our kitchen table with a stack of documents between us, that I finally understood the difference between those two questions, between being someone things happened to, and being someone who decided what happened next. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone. You're always so dramatic about your little rules. I thought about the seating chart, table 14, the smile on Vanessa's face as I hit the marble floor. I thought about 11 years without my grandmother because of a story that was never true. For 30 years, I had been infrastructure in that family, something they built comfort on top of, and never maintained, something they assumed would hold, no matter the load, right up until it became more convenient for me to be broken than standing. But infrastructure doesn't have to stay in the ground once. It understands what it's actually carrying. I want the truth in front of everyone who was in that ballroom, I told Nathan. Not quietly, not in a lawyer's office where they can spin it later. I want it laid out the way I'd lay out a structural failure report. Documented, undeniable, impossible to argue with. He nodded slowly, the corner of his mouth lifting for the first time in weeks. Then we're going to need more than a maintenance log, he said. We're going to need everything. I looked down at the spreadsheet on my laptop. 3 weeks of records, transfers, invoices, a decade of quiet theft dressed up as sacrifice, and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt since before the wedding. Not peace. Not yet. Just certainty. I already have most of it, I said. What I need now is the piece that ties it together. The one that proves this wasn't an accident and it wasn't a moment of anger. Nathan reached across the table and turned his laptop toward me. On the screen was an email he'd received that morning from the hotel's legal department, responding to the formal records request he'd filed the night of the wedding. Attached to it was the full uncut security footage from the ballroom, starting 6 hours before the reception began. They already sent it, he said quietly. I haven't watched it yet. I was waiting for you. If you've ever sat in front of proof you weren't sure you were ready to see, you know exactly the breath I took before I clicked play. Because whatever was on that footage, I already understood one thing with total clarity. Whatever my mother and sister thought they'd gotten away with. The building was about to be inspected properly, for the very first time. The footage started at 7 in the morning, hours before the first guest arrived, the ballroom empty except for staff, setting up chairs, and a woman in a gray blazer directing them. Vanessa's wedding coordinator, moving through the space like she owned it. Nathan and I watched in silence, coffee going cold beside both of us. At 9:14 a.m., the timestamp caught something neither of us expected. Vanessa walked into frame. Alone, still in leggings and a hoodie, hours from hair and makeup, carrying a small toolkit I recognized because I'd seen one just like it in my own garage. She knelt beside the dessert table's marble base. I leaned closer to the screen, my chest tightening, watching my sister's hands move with a precision that told me this wasn't her first time touching a wrench. She adjusted something at the base of the table, checked it, adjusted again, glancing over her shoulder twice before straightening up and walking away like nothing had happened. Pause it, I said. Nathan froze the frame. I stared at the timestamp. 9:22 a.m. 9 hours before I would stand near that exact table, refilling a water glass, before my mother's hand closed around my arm. She loosened the base, I said quietly. She deliberately compromised the load's stability. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that, because I expected to. I had spent 30 years absorbing every kind of pain that family could hand me, and I always cried, quietly, alone, later. This time watching my sister engineer the exact moment my body would hit marble. I felt something colder, settle into place instead. If you've ever watched proof of a betrayal, you already suspected but weren't ready to see. You know that particular stillness. It doesn't feel like heartbreak. It feels like the last piece of a structure, finally locking into position. We kept watching. At 6:47 p.m., 40 minutes before I arrived, my mother appeared on camera, walking a slow circuit around the dessert table. She stopped exactly where Vanessa had knelt that morning. She crouched, pressed her palm flat against the table's edge, and gave it a small testing push. It held, but barely. She straightened, smoothed her dress, and walked away, satisfied. Nathan didn't say anything for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet in a way I'd only heard once before, the week his own father passed. They tested it, he said, both of them, separately. I closed the laptop. We didn't need to watch the rest. We already had what mattered. Proof the shove hadn't been a single moment of cruelty born from an argument or a bad mood. It had been staged, built, load tested, hours in advance, by two women who understood exactly what they were doing and did it anyway. If you've ever needed proof that something wasn't an accident before you could finally stop making excuses for someone, drop a comment, because what came next is the part I never expected to happen so fast. I called my grandmother's attorney the next morning. I hadn't planned to loop him in this quickly. But once I explained what the footage showed, he told me something that changed the shape of what came next. 5 years earlier, after watching how my mother treated me at a family gathering, my grandmother had quietly rewritten her estate. She'd never told me. She'd never told anyone, not even my mother, who still believed the old will was the operative one. The new will contained a single condition, buried in careful legal language, my grandmother had insisted on. Anyone proven to have physically harmed me or endangered my child would immediately forfeit their entire inheritance. That share would transfer directly to me and my daughter. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear, staring at nothing, understanding for the first time that my grandmother had seen this coming years before any of us did. She always said your mother would eventually go too far, the attorney told me. She just didn't know when. We scheduled a reading of the will for the following week. My mother assumed it was routine, a formality connected to some minor asset. Vanessa assumed the same. Neither knew what was coming, and for the first time since the wedding, I let myself feel something close to steadiness. The reading took place in a conference room downtown. My mother and Vanessa seated across from me, both dressed like they were attending a business meeting rather than the unraveling of everything they'd built. The attorney read through the standard language first. Property, accounts, small bequests to cousins neither of us had spoken to in years. My mother's foot tapped under the table, impatient, waiting for the part that mattered to her. Then he reached the condition. I watched my mother's face change in real time. The color didn't drain from it slowly. It dropped all at once, the way a structure fails when the load finally exceeds what it can bear. That clause can't be real, she said. She never told me about any changes. She wasn't required to, the attorney said calmly, and connected his laptop to the screen at the end of the room. The footage played in silence. Vanessa kneeling at the table's base at 9:14 a.m. My mother testing its stability at 6:47 p.m. The timestamp, the tools, the deliberate glances over their shoulders. No body in that room spoke for almost a full minute. Vanessa's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. My mother's hands, folded tightly on the table, had begun to shake, not from cold, but from the particular panic of watching your own carefully maintained story collapse in real time, in front of the one person you'd always assumed would stay quiet. Serena, my mother finally said, her voice breaking into something I hadn't heard from her in decades. You have to understand. I do understand, I said. That's the problem. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. 30 years of being told I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. And in that moment, I finally understood that the loudest thing in the room wasn't anger. It was proof. If you've ever watched the truth do more damage to someone than you ever could have said out loud, you know exactly what silence sounds like in a room like that. The attorney continued, his voice level, unmoved by the tears, now sliding down Vanessa's face. Under the terms of the amended will, both my mother and Vanessa forfeited their portions of the estate immediately and irrevocably. Every dollar, every property, every account that would have gone to them, instead transferred to me and held in trust to my daughter. Vanessa's fiancé's family, informed separately by the attorney's office, given the criminal exposure involved, canceled the wedding within the week. The engagement dissolved publicly enough to make the local paper, not because I'd said a word to a reporter, but because greed, once exposed, tends to make its own headlines. My mother tried calling for weeks afterward. I let most of them go to voicemail. The ones I answered I kept short. Being family gave you access to my heart, I told her, the last time we spoke. It never gave you permission to break it. I didn't say it with rage. I said it, the way you'd state a fact about load limits. Calmly, because it was simply true. And because I finally understood that I didn't owe her the performance of forgiveness just to make the conversation easier for her. 3 months later, I gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Nathan cried in a way I'd never seen from him, holding her like she was the most structurally sound thing he'd ever encountered. My grandmother, 81 years old and finally back in my life, after 11 lost years, held her granddaughter's granddaughter and told me she was proud of me. Not for the money, not for the will, but for finally learning the difference between people who deserve your loyalty and people who simply expect it. I think about that difference often now. About how long I spent believing love was something you earned through endurance, through absorbing weight without complaint, through staying quiet, so the people above you could keep standing on your back. It isn't. Real family doesn't calculate what they can extract from you before you finally break. They don't need proof of your worth measured in inheritance clauses and security footage. They just show up without an agenda and stay. I walked out of that conference room that day, with my daughter kicking gently under my ribs, and for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't carrying anyone's weight but my own. If this story hit home for you, if you've ever had to do the math on who actually deserved a place in your life, you know exactly what it means to finally set that weight down. That's the whole reason we tell these stories here. Thank you for watching this Shadow Drama Stories original. If Serena's story moved you, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and share this with someone who needs to hear that walking away isn't losing. It's finally choosing yourself. We'll see you in the next story.